about their injuries, or is it a no-worries situation? Welcome to We're Talking AFC. I'm Lauren Shehadi, your fantasy football writer, Jamey Eisenberg. Tom Brady, just 2 years removed from an NFL record 50 touchdown passes. As a fantasy owner, when you're going into the draft, Jamey, are you worried at all?
Well, we're going to find out if you should be worried once he steps on the field for training camp. But Lauren, that's one of the biggest topics facing fantasy owners, especially when you're looking at AFC teams. Tom Brady coming back from the knee injury. We know last year he was a first-round pick, missed all of the season after getting hurt in week 1, and now he's going to come back and try to lead this Patriots offense. I think he's going to be fine. All signs this offseason have pointed toward him making a full recovery, which means Randy Moss, Wes Welker, that entire passing game should be 100%. When you're talking about the Cincinnati Bengals, Carson Palmer, a lot of questions there with the Bengals because we saw Palmer did not have surgery but did miss most of the season coming back from this elbow problem. Going to impact a lot of players because you talk about Chad Ochocinco, which is his new name. You talk about Lavernius Coles, now in Cincinnati. You talk about Chris Henry, who Palmer said has the potential to be a Randy Moss-type wide receiver. This is a big passing game that a lot of fantasy owners are going to target. We have to see if, in fact, he's going to be okay. Interesting note about Palmer, he's going to be on a pitch count. I know we're talking football, but he is going to be on a pitch count during training camp, only 150 throws per day.
All right, well, we will see how that works out. And how will things work out for Matt Castle in Kansas City, as well as you got T.O. in Buffalo? Old faces, new places, Jamey.
Yeah, that's always an interesting part of the offseason is where these guys end up with their new teams. The T.O. show is already ready, fired up, ready to go. As a matter of fact, just before we started taping this, I got off the phone with Fred Jackson, running back for the Buffalo Bills. He's so excited about having T.O. as a teammate. I think fantasy owners are going to find that Owen's numbers are going to be very similar to what we saw last year in Dallas. Not exactly great statistics, but he's still going to be close to double digits in touchdowns. His numbers should be good across the board. I think he's still a very quality number 2 wide receiver. You talk about Matt Castle in Kansas City. A lot of question marks there because he was so successful with New England and getting them to playoff contention. They didn't make the playoffs, but he still did a good job in replacing a guy like Tom Brady, but he doesn't have those Randy Moss, Wes Welker type weapons around him. You look at Torrey Holt in Jacksonville, that's another big move this offseason, going to help David Garrard potentially get back to being a number 1 fantasy quarterback. I think you've got to view Holt as a number 3 wide receiver with the potential to be a number 2. And then Fred Taylor could be taking that old game, still plugging away at 34 years old. I think he'll be a good number 3 fantasy running back in New England.
You mentioned the T.O. show. Are you talking about the reality show?
No, I'm talking about the show on the field.
All right, that's what we're talking about, the show on the field. 2 teams known for great passing attacks have some issues at wide receiver.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you talk about Marvin Harrison being gone in Indianapolis. How are they going to replace him? I think it's going to come from 2 separate sources, but I think Peyton Manning's still going to remain a number 1 fantasy quarterback, obviously going to be among the top 3 options when you look at Tom Brady coming back as well as Drew Brees. But I think you talk about the receiving core for Indianapolis. Anthony Gonzalez now becomes a starter. He goes from being the 3rd option to the 2nd option behind Reggie Wayne. And Dallas Clark, I think people should target him as the number 1 fantasy tight end because both those guys are going to share in replacing a guy like Marvin Harrison. When you look in Denver, where Brandon Marshall, sort of a question mark about how he's going to be coming off-season hip surgery, also wanting a new contract. He did report on time to training camp with the rookies and injured players, so that's a good sign that he could be motivated because he doesn't want to be fined. As we know, Lauren, they lose money if they don't show up. So we're going to see Brandon Marshall on the field. We need to see Marshall there for a couple reasons. 1, for Kyle Orton, making sure he's okay and can be a legitimate fantasy option. And then 2, making that entire offense click because if Marshall's not on the field, I don't like Eddie Royal as much. So we need to see both those guys there. And then as we know, I think you and Dave talked about this in the last video, Derek Mason retires in Baltimore. They did try to bring in Drew Bennett. He did sign for 1 day, felt his knees not up to par, and retired as well. So now they're still looking for a wide receiver. If, in fact, they don't have anybody there to step up, Mark Clayton is going to assume the number 1 role. He's a number 4 fantasy wide receiver.
You know, you're talking about an offense clicking, and you can't do that without a guy under center. Sometimes you got to throw some bows to get your job. We're talking about quarterback battles. One in New York, of course, with Clemens and Sanchez, and then in Cleveland, Quinn and Anderson. Who's fighting and winning, Jamey?
You know, Lauren, I think if the stat is correct, since 1980, there have only been 16 rookie starting quarterbacks, so Mark Sanchez does not have a lot in his favor. Although 2 guys last year, we saw Matt Ryan and Joe Flacco, and Rex Ryan, the head coach of the Jets, saw Flacco firsthand come in and start as a rookie and lead the team to the playoffs. So he's going to give Sanchez every opportunity to beat out Kellen Clemens. Neither of these guys are really great fantasy options. I think you're talking about number 3 fantasy quarterback. So in deep leagues, if you're looking to draft a 3rd guy, at some point, either one, whoever's a starter, may play a role, and you could add them off the waiver wire if they get hot and the matchups are right. But I wouldn't go into a standard seasonal draft planning on drafting either of the Jets quarterbacks. Sanchez obviously has a little bit more value in keeper leagues. And then when you talk about Cleveland, we think Brady Quinn has the best fantasy value of those two guys there. Derek Anderson, we know 2 years ago, was very successful, but this entire receiving core for Cleveland has changed. Braylon Edwards, I think, is a guy that can be like Chad Ochocinco, can bounce back and be a very good fantasy option this year, but he needs to have that guy getting the ball. We think it's going to be Quinn, but again, he's a low-end number 2 fantasy quarterback.
Okay, and before we let you go, we want to talk about running backs, and we want to start a lot of speculation. We want to start with Knowshon Moreno in Denver. A lot of question marks here all the way across the board, Jamey.
Yeah, this is a wild, wild division, wild AFC West, as we always like to talk about. You know, you look at all the running backs pretty much for all these teams, starting with Denver with Knowshon Moreno. Obviously, a lot of hype coming in with a very successful college career at Georgia. But the longer he waits to sign his contract, he could sign any day now, could report on time, but I think you're going to see possibly a holdout situation. He was the first running back drafted, so that's going to really impact guys like Donald Brown, Beanie Wells in terms of them signing their contracts. But I think you talk about Moreno, a lot of work for him to do in training camp because he's got to battle guys like Lamont Jordan, Correll Buckalter, even Ryan Terrain coming back from a knee injury, and Peyton Hillis. So a lot of work for him to do there to prove to fantasy owners he can be a valuable fantasy option. I think you still view him as a number 3 guy with some upside. You talk about Larry Johnson coming back from a really disappointing season. I think he'll be fine. You know, somebody that you can get with good value as a number 2, maybe even a number 3 running back. He's going to fall to you probably in round 4 or 5. That's good value to take someone like him. Darren McFadden's one of my favorite fantasy guys this year because he gets Lorenzo Neal in front of him. And we know Lorenzo Neal in his history turned LaDainian Tomlinson into what he is. Did wonders with guys like Corey Dillon and the running game in Baltimore. Everywhere he's been as a fullback, he's really helped that running back shine. I like McFadden a lot. And then speaking of Tomlinson and
that
Sproles.
Last guy on your list. What a difference a year makes,
That's
right?
the guy. Yeah, last year this time we're sitting here saying he's the number 1 guy in every draft. I still think he's a first-round guy. Now, Dave and I disagree on this a little bit. I still think you can get him toward the end of the first round. That's good value for him. If he slips to you in round 2, definitely be happy about that. And Darren Sproles is going to be fine. I think they're going to share carries and do a good job. But LT, one more good season left. You can still draft him as your starter.
Okay, if you have questions about your draft, Jamey Eisenberg is taking time out of his day, he as well as Dave Richard, and they're going to rate your draft. Tell us about it.
Yeah, go to Rate My Draft. It's on fantasynews.cbssports.com. Submit your draft. We will rate it for you, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at some of the remarks that will give you some tips in terms of making your team better throughout the course of the year.
What more can you ask for? A good fantasy football season,
the NFC
right?
coming up, don't forget.
That's right. Check it out right here on CBSSports.com. We'll see you soon.